Dark Souls 2 is not by any means the most difficult Souls game, and most of the difficulty doesn't come from the bosses, but the areas in between the bosses. However, with 42 total bosses, including the DLC ones, not all of the bosses are easy. So here's my list of the top 10 hardest bosses in Dark Souls 2. And remember, this is just my opinion. Added in the Crown of the Sunken King DLC, Elana acted as the first real challenge in the first DLC for Dark Souls 2, and she is immediately nothing like the other boss fights in the game, mainly utilizing her dark magic and dark pyromancy to keep you far away from her and dealing massive damage. This fight really takes a turn, however, once she starts summoning minions to fight alongside her. She can summon anything from a number of skeletons to Velstadt himself, but that's really where the difficulty of this fight comes from, and that's why she's the lowest on the list. Because other than that, Elana herself has a small health pool, and as long as you're good at dodging her magic, she doesn't provide much of a challenge. The randomness of her summons completely dictates how hard the fight itself will be. If she summons only a couple skeletons, you can easily walk around them and avoid them. However, if she summons Velstadt, you are essentially fighting two bosses at once. If Elana herself was more difficult, or if her summons were more guaranteed, I would have put her way higher on the list. If fighting two bosses at once sounds difficult to you, the next bosses on this list will prove to be much more of a challenge. Even though they aren't technically the last boss in the game, the Throne Watcher and Defender prove to be much more of a challenge than both Nasandra or Aldia. If you were able to take these two on individually as their own bosses, they wouldn't be much of a challenge. But both of them together with almost completely different fighting styles, they work off each other like yin and yang. The Throne Watcher is a fast and agile boss that dashes and thrusts much akin to the Lost Sinner, and the Throne Defender is a heavily armored, slow-moving boss with a shield whose health pool is noticeably larger. Your best bet with these two is going to be to try to separate them on opposite sides of the arena, which isn't too hard since the Defender is a lot slower. There is a catch though. Both of these bosses have to be defeated at relatively the same time, or else they will be revived. If you defeat one of the two before the other, they will be knocked down to their knees, and after a short delay, they will get back up, recovering a good amount of their health. On top of everything, as soon as the either one hits 50% health, their weapons will get buffed, and they will not only deal more damage, but they will also expand their moveset, only making them harder. These two have always been a struggle during any of my challenge runs, unlike this next boss. A completely optional boss that can easily lock new players out of their run, the Ancient Dragon can be a health sponge with the potential to one-shot you. Once you have this fight down, it's an absolute joke. But like I said before, for the new players who didn't know this fight was optional, or for the players who just wanted to take on a challenge on their first playthrough, he is no joke. His large AoE attacks can be hard to dodge, while dealing nearly half your health bar per hit. But that is nothing compared to his enormous dragon breath that fills nearly the entire arena, and will usually one-shot you. However, this can all become trivial as soon as you figure out that if you stay by his back left leg, you have completely mitigated his AoE attacks. Then all you have to do is chip away at his seemingly never-ending health bar. Love that. That is until he flies up into the air, and at this point, you want to immediately run to the tip of his tail as fast as you can. This will allow you to dodge his dragon breath. After that, it's just rinse and repeat. This is far from the only dragon in Dark Souls 2, and it definitely isn't the hardest. That title goes to Sinh. Unlike the Ancient Dragon, Sinh is quick, making his way around the arena at a much faster pace. His arena doesn't help you much either, with the pillars and stalagmites that not only block you, but block your vision as well. When you do get the opportunity to attack Sinh, you will most likely only be able to get 2 or 3 attacks in before he either attacks back or flies off. And staying near his back legs like the Ancient Dragon won't do you much good either, because he'll either do his 180 flame attack or whip you with his tail. And staying near his head will cause Sinh to either bite you or spew fire directly at you. This is why Sinh is much easier if you're using a strength build with a huge weapon, opposed to fast attacking builds like dexterity. Adding to the difficulty, each one of Sin's attacks leave behind a poison cloud or apply poison to you directly, so make sure you stock up on purple moss clumps. And on top of that, his attacks as well as hitting him will degrade your weapons much faster than normal. So for most people, you'll need 2 different upgraded weapons or some repair powder to take him down. If you ask any veteran Souls player, most will say that Sinh is just a reskin of Calamite from the first Dark Souls. However, with the speed and added moves, I think Sinh is a welcome addition to the trilogy. But with our next boss, there is no debate on whether they are just a reskin or not. When most players start their first playthrough of Dark Souls 2, the first major road bump they come across is the Smelter demon. And when the Crown of the Old Iron King DLC came out, From Software thought it would be hilarious to add a straight up reskin of the Smelter demon. Only this time he has much more health, deals more damage, and deals magic damage instead of fire damage. But just like the Smelter demon, you're stuck in a very small arena, which becomes an issue when the blue Smelter demon jumps around and does huge AoE damage with a massive sword and roar attack. And this fight gets progressively harder as it goes on, because the boss will not only give himself a permanent cloak of magic damage, but also gives himself a huge buff to his sword at half health. A few well-timed dodges and sharp awareness should help out tremendously, but this isn't your first rodeo with a Smelter demon, so you may die quite a few times. But in the end, you should be able to beat him. Luckily, the run back isn't too bad, especially compared to our next boss, Lud and Zallen, who most likely has the worst boss run back in any From Software game to date. Because hiking your way across the frozen tundra with almost no guiding walls or markers, you can easily find yourself getting lost on your way back. So let's try to make sure you don't have to retry these tigers. Both tigers have the same moveset as Ava the tiger you fought much earlier in the DLC, but with less health. But don't get it twisted, this doesn't mean they are easier, since they still deal the same amount of damage as Ava did. They do a mix of both magical and non-magical attacks, including a homing missile attack. Whenever they are about to do a non-magical attack, roll towards them, and this will usually cause you to be either behind or below them, giving you an opportunity to either strike or heal. But if they use the homing missiles, run towards them as fast as possible and try to get behind them, and this will cause the missiles to miss you and allow for an opening to get a few hits in. When both tigers are out, try positioning yourself in between them and use one as a meat shield to protect yourself from the other. Whenever Zallen becomes low health, he becomes enraged, giving him increased damage, and this lasts about 2 minutes. If you're not on New Game Plus, your best bet is to try to burst one down, but if you're not using a meta weapon, this can be a challenge. But hopefully with these tips, you will only have to fight these guys once and not have to make the insane run back. If Lud and Zallen have the worst run back in From Software games, this next boss is a great candidate for second place. Chances are, most people who have played Dark Souls 2 haven't even fought Darklurker, considering the long and tedious side quests you have to go through to even access the fight. But once you do, you will realize that not only is he one of the most difficult, but one of the coolest and most fun fights in the game that feels like it is straight out of a Kingdom Hearts game. When starting the fight with Darklurker, you shouldn't have much problems dodging his magical attacks. This fight truly starts when Darklurker starts to duplicate himself, doubling up on his attacks and attacking from multiple places in the arena. And at this point, he will employ mainly range attacks, including a homing crystal soul spear, hand lasers, powerful fireballs, and most dangerous of all, a dark magic attack that will appear above you and home in on you, dealing massive AoE damage. Even though all of the Dark Lurkers share one large health bar, finding an opening to attack can be brutal, especially if you're a melee character, so unfortunately, you may have to make this terrible run back a few times. Following the theme of fighting multiple enemies at once in a boss fight, next we have the Burnt Ivory King. Honestly, the top 3 bosses on this list could be placed in any order, but for the sake of this video, we're putting the Burnt Ivory King in number 3. Before you even start this fight, make sure you grab all 3 knights around a Liam Lois to help you fight off the waves of charred Lois knights you will have to battle throughout this fight and come out of the portals in the arena. Once the portals have been sealed and the charred knights have been defeated, your fight with the Burnt Ivory King will begin. And for all of our Demon Souls fans out there, the Burnt Ivory King shares the same moveset as King Alonne, meaning he has a jumping spin, a lunging attack, and he utilizes his large greatsword to deal most of his damage. But periodically throughout the fight, the king will take a few seconds to buff his sword, and during this time he doesn't gain a defense buff like most bosses, meaning it gives you an ample time to get attacks in. While his sword is buffed, he gains new moves like an ice explosion, where he slams his sword on the ground and it fills the arena with ice spikes, dealing huge damage. He also gains an impale attack, where he will lunge at the player and grab them and drain a large amount of health and throw them on the ground. Overall, he ends up being one of the most stylish bosses in the entire game, only losing to our next boss, Sir Alonne. Sir Alonne is a true samurai with the utmost honor, whose speed and precise attacks can leave even the most experienced Souls player trying this boss for hours. Not only is he one of the hardest bosses, but he is also one of the best designed bosses in my opinion. His attacks are telegraphed just enough to make them difficult to dodge, but also feel somewhat fair when they hit you. He wields a large katana that has crazy range and causes bleed, meaning it can melt even the tankiest of players. On top of all of this, he boasts a large moveset including a lunge, a 3-hit combo, a jump, a projectile, and even a parry, turning this fight into more of a duel than a fight itself. Your only chance of beating Sir Alonne involves precise dodges, well-timed attacks, and a lot of patience, making this one of the hardest fights in the game, hands down. But not nearly as hard as this next boss, and our number 1 spot on the list, Fume Knight. Fume Knight has smelter wedges scattered throughout Broom Tower, and you can utilize these to shut down the 4 idols on the sides of the arena. Without doing this, Fume Knight will heal anytime he gets near the edges of the arena, and you really don't want this considering how hard the fight already is. Fume Knight has a large health pool, a massive sword, and plenty of mobility. Speaking of the massive sword, it does so much damage. I'm so serious, each hit takes a ginormous chunk out of your health bar, and just like Sir Alonne, Fume Knight has a riposte or a parry that can be troublesome if you don't pay attention. Once he reaches around half health, he becomes empowered, increasing his AoE on all of his sword attacks, and increasing his damage to near one-shot potential. And with all the wonky hitboxes in Dark Souls 2, it makes it feel like this is nearly impossible for new players, solidifying the Fume Knight as the hardest boss in Dark Souls 2. That was my list of the top 10 bosses in Dark Souls 2. If you like this video, I'm sure you'll like this video where I rank every boss in Dark Souls 2 from worst to best. I hope you have a great day. Bye bye.